Okay, so I'm going to start putting together short videos just to cover off quick concepts to help people ramp up quickly to proprietarian ideas in regular language rather than e-crime. So let's start with property. Now, none of this is rehearsed or written. I'm just going to riff off the top of my head, so take that into to account. I'll do the best I can for you. Let's start with property. There's a few notions on what property is. There's property is possession, which is sort of a more the anarchist leftist view on property, which is something along the lines that property is that which you keep in your possession. And as long as you keep it in possession and can keep it in your possession, it's yours. So for instance, they'll argue that buying a second home and renting it out to somebody is immoral, and it breaks the notion of legitimate property. Legitimate doesn't mean anything, but legitimate property. Because as soon as you hand over the key to a house, the key being a lock that retains the possession for you, as soon as you hand that key over to the renter, you've handed over possession of that property to them. So it now becomes their property. And you no longer have a claim to charge them money for access to that property. So that's property as a possession. So you think of this as the most base form of property. So imagine, we'll use the man in nature notion that a lot of Enlightenment thinkers used. Imagine you're a man in nature and you pick up a stick because it makes a good club. And it's good enough that you choose to keep it. Somebody else comes along, likes your club, so they beat you up and they take the club away. In that sense, it's no longer your property. It's theirs. As long as you're not able to defend it and they're able to take it, you can't retain it in your possession. So it ceases to be your property. So that's the logic behind it. And if you want to put that into modern context, when we have these black bloc environmentalist protests, like here in Canada or any thaw down south, when they're burning garbage bags and breaking, or garbage bins and breaking windows, they're coming from the notion that none of that is legitimate property. If it's not in somebody's immediate possession, then nobody owns it. So they're not really doing property damage. What they're doing is they're confronting our false notion, this abstraction of property. Okay, so on one level, there's some truth to that. If you can't keep property in your possession, it's not yours. That's just de facto. That's the fact of the matter. Now we have the Lockean notion that what property is a homesteaded or acquired material that we mix our labor with. And by mixing our labor with it, we add value to it. So then that added value then gives us a claim to that material object as property. Now this is a justificationary argument. They're trying to find a justification as to why somebody would have a claim to the argument. So beyond just being able to keep it in your possession, say somebody came and you took your club and you debarked it and you carved a handle into it. So you've mixed your labor with it. You've made it more valuable. And somebody comes along and beats you up and takes it under a Lockean notion, because you put that effort into it, you increased its value. It's still your property. And what they've done is they've stolen your property. They've done an immoral act. So they're trying to find a moral justification for what property is. It's a justificationary argument. But it's not incorrect either, that the property is something that we invest in. We put our care into it, and we put our our time or our concern into these objects to seek a benefit from them. So that when somebody comes up and tries to beat you up and take it, you fight back. So the reason why you fight back to keep it in your possession is because you see value in it. And often the value you see in it pertains to the investment that you put into it, whether that's seeking it out or changing it through labor. There's is we put ourselves into it. So when it's taken from us. And we try to defend that investment. So that's the second notion of property. And as I said, they both have some truth to it. But here's the thing. I could say that beating you up and taking your club is an investment of my labor into that object. So I've mixed my labor into it by clubbing you over the head with my fists. And then that notion kind of falls apart. And mixing your labor with something doesn't imbue it with some magical property that we call, or a magical property that turns it into property, the material. So there's some truth to both of these, but they're both incorrect, or incomplete, I should say. So let me walk you down a thought experiment as to why material objects, possessions, and property, which is not limited to material possessions, doesn't have anything to do with the object itself, but it has everything to do with human behavior. In other words, property isn't a thing. Property is a human reaction to things. So let's say I buy a TV, 42-inch TV. It's a great TV. I paid $1,000 for it. If somebody tried to break in my house and steal it, I'd probably get upset, call the police or fight them for it. So I would work to keep it within my possession because it's my TV. I don't want to lose it. And then you fast forward 10 years and you decide that TV's not big enough for me anymore. I want a 50-inch TV and I want the new screen. So I go out and I buy that TV. Now I've got this old TV here. Looking at it, I don't want to be bothered to sell it. I've got nowhere to put it, and it seems like a shame to throw it in a dumpster. So I put it out on the end of my driveway with a free sign on it. Anybody can come along, take that TV. It's no problem. I'm not going to fight them for it. I'm not going to keep it in my possession. Now, that TV hasn't changed. It hasn't changed from before I bought it to when I bought it to when I put it on the curb. The TV isn't changing. So it wasn't my property. I bought it. It became my property. I put it out on the street corner, and it becomes somebody else's property. The material object hasn't changed at all. What's changed is my attitude towards it. So this is a notion called Vitruvianism, or how I use the term Vitruvianism, which is an incorrect way of using it. It's the idea that concepts that are exclusive to humans are better described by human behavior than they are by ideal or essential definitions of an essence. We're better off to define them by the behavior that humans exhibit around them. So that's to say that what property is the stuff that we invest in to seek a benefit or to seek some value, that we would like to preserve that benefit or that value to the extent that we would defend it. So property is really a human behavior that if there's something valuable there enough for me to want to care for it, to maintain it, so to keep it in my possession against entropy, or to defend it against somebody else, then that's my property. That's what property is. And once you have that notion at hand, there's a whole stack of stuff that is not stuff, it's not material stuff, that fits that description of behavior. So, and we use this within our own language. When we use the possessive in language, it aligns perfectly with this definition of property. So I might say that this is my car, which is no different than a material possession. It's my car. But I might also say my wife. And when I say my wife, I don't mean it in the same sense that I mean my car. Because with a material possession, I have exclusive rights of use over it. Like it's mine to decide what's going to be done with it. Well, that's not the case with my wife. I'm not saying that she's a possession, but she is my property. Or I might say my philosophy, and that I've invested in it to understand it. I've made it my own. I live by it. And if somebody insults it, I will defend it. I will correct the record. I'm behaving towards that as though it's property. So a good example of that is my religion. People fight wars over religion. That's because religion is a property. It's a demonstrated interest that people are willing to defend. So that is the demonstrated definition of property, meaning that it's a definition defined by what we demonstrate around it, rather than axiomatic claims. So the demonstrated definition of property is that which you invest in to seek a benefit, future benefit or value, to the extent that you would defend it. A short term for that is to just say a demonstrated investment. So if we go back to the carved club that we have, that somebody comes along and takes from us, the reason why beating somebody up and taking it doesn't make it yours in terms of identifying property in this case is that the investment in it is different. Their investment is in theft, while your investment is within increasing value of the object. So when it comes to sort of defining ownership or attachment to that property, it comes down to a demonstration of investment that's free of these externalities, these acts that break reciprocity. So that's the first thing. Property is demonstrated investment. Ownership, having exclusive control over something, is a small subset of property that is particular to possessions. And then we'll have another range where, maybe we're shareholders in a business. So we have shared ownership over a property. And then there's properties that have nothing to do with ownership at all, like my family or my culture or my religion. I don't own it, I don't control it, but I invest in it to the extent that I behave towards it as though it's a property. So it's actually a great compliment to treat somebody as though they're your property. Where we normally think of calling, say, for instance, my wife is my property. It's this derogatory term that we're reducing her value to a possession. Whereas I'm saying it's not about possession, it's about demonstrated investment. That she is my property because I love her to the point that I will behave properly with her so that we can stay together. So I'm demonstrating that our relationship is a property. My daughter is the same way. My dog is the same way. My family, my civilization, my community. Okay, so that covers off property. But things don't exist as discrete elements. They exist within conditions, within a constant relation in relation to their limits. So property rights, as we understand it, God-given property rights, this sort of thing, falls back onto this justificationary language again, where what justifies a right is mixing your labor with the product. And then we're like, well, so where does that right come from? Well, it comes from God, or it comes from nature, so we'll call it a natural right. And this is a flawed notion. This is collapsing scales. So let's break down what the spectrum is and what those transformations of property are. So we'll go back to man and nature. And I'm there with my club, and it's mine as long as I can keep it in my hands. And that's true, regardless of how much I invested in it and how I'm behaving towards it. It stays my possession if I can keep it in my possession. And I'll try to keep it in my possession because it's property. But if you come along and you take my club, there's not a whole hell of a lot I can do about it. I can try and defend myself from it. So if I live over here and you live over there and you have your property that I can go club you over the head with and take, and I have my property that you can come club me over the head and take. We have to spend a certain amount of effort in defending ourselves. So for instance, you wouldn't leave your club in your camp and walk away because somebody else might pick it up. You know, you've relinquished your ability to defend it. And that becomes costly. So what happens is that you and I can come to an agreement. You can say, listen, this isn't working. I need to go hunting. I can't carry every one of my possessions when I'm going hunting. This just sucks. This is stupid. Let's just agree to not steal each other's shit. And if you agree and I agree, then we can offset the costs of defending or protecting our possessions so that we can move on to other productive activities. At this point, property is shifting from possessions only to something that's recognized within a social environment. 1 second while my phone rings. Let me just pause. Okay, sorry about that. Where was I? Yes. The transmutation from property as a possession that requires the immediate need to defend into a social agreement. It's at the point in which we decide and we agree to respect each other's property. Those possessions transform from sort of this base physical level, the de facto level, I quite often call it. De facto just means of fact, into a social realm. That the property now exists partially between our agreement not to infringe on each other's investments. So this is where the sort of the drive to justificationary language in the past has come from. They're trying to find a reason why, beyond social agreement, property has sort of a more substantial footing. They're trying to justify your stance within that social agreement. So I might make the claim that because I carved that club, it is mine. So when you get into these border issues of deciding what's within that social agreement or not, we have this criteria for it. So mixing labor with the product becomes a main criteria in that, in terms of material possessions. But there's a problem with property within the social context alone. And that's that it only exists as long as the people agree to stick to the agreement. As long as people are willing to stick to the agreement, then your possessions remain property that you no longer need to put a lot of effort into to protect. So the next notion comes in, which is to have a third-party insurer of that property. So let's expand on our scenario again, where there's me living over here and you living over there, and you have your stuff, I have my stuff. But there are other people around us as well, and we've all agreed to not take each other's stuff. And if one person within that group does it, breaks the agreement, the rest of the group stands up to prosecute them. So they insure the agreement, the third-party insurance of the agreement between the two parties that are at odds. This notion of third-party insurance is where property rights emerge, and that the rights to property is the criteria in which the third-party insurer determines or decides what is property to defend and what is not, and by what criteria they will use the violence to enforce the agreement. So property rights is way down the line from what you would call nature or de facto. There is no de facto property rights. There is no de facto claim to property without a social agreement. So we have three different points of property on a spectrum, going from no institutionalization into an informal institution of a social agreement into a formal institution of enforcement. So on the base level, we have possession. On the informal level, we have claims to property, and then on the formal institutional level, we have property rights. Okay, So I think to cover that off is the importance of what a demonstrated definition is. That a demonstrated definition is measuring a concept by human behavior rather than ideals, ideal definitions. That justificationary language patches over the lack of a demonstrated definition, and that things like rights or property agreements exist in different states given different conditions. Those might be a few things to think about, and that covers off the proprietarian demonstrated definition of property.